Okay, I want to briefly talk about the difference between ethics and law, or the questions, is it legal or is it ethical? Because before we get into the questions about is it good for me, is it good for others, is it fair, is it just, and that sort of stuff, we need to sort out that issue. There's lots of regulations out there that tell you what to do. Ethics tells you what to do, the law tells you what to do. Okay? There are rules of companies that tell you what to do. They're kind of like laws. All right. So when you ask the question, is it legal or does it violate some rules or something like that? What exactly are we talking about? Well, okay, what I want to begin with is basically this. A law is an ordinance of reason, right? Created by one in authority, right, to promote the common welfare. And we said we've got practices out there, and then the practices out there, we see that people do certain things that don't benefit the community, and then you pass laws against them, or you punish them, or you give people time out, or that sort of stuff. So it's the same sort of deal with regular law and that sort of stuff. Uh, so it's an ordinance of reason, right, promulgated by somebody in authority. In that case, it's the society in general or some specified authority. All right. It's got to be promulgated. That is, it's got to be published. You got to know it. You got to tell people what to do. However you do that when you're kids, you tell them to do that. You go into a company, work for them. They give you the rules. Right. Your boss has the authority. Right. And it's got to be for the sake of the common good, whatever that means. And we'll get into that question of the good fairly shortly. Now, it might help, though, to understand the purpose of the law. I always think it helps to understand the purposes of things. And from that point of view, the law becomes the public's agency for translating morality into explicit social guidelines and practices. Right? So they translate the morality into explicit guidelines and practices. And here's the important thing, and for stipulating punishments. All right? Now, whenever you have practices, you're going to have some outliers and some free riders and people like that who don't want to obey the practices because they're not inclined to, or for whatever other reason. That's the psychology of why people do unacceptable things. We're not going to get into that today. But those people do that. Now, how do you get them back in on track? Well, you stipulate some sorts of punishment. So you've got regulations. One of the things that happened with the financial services that you had regulations on leverage, and then you let the regulations get looser and looser and looser. And of course, the people took advantage of it. Before that, you had Glass-Steagall Act that put limitations on that. And if you violated that, then you were indicted or prosecuted or something like that. We'll see whether people get prosecuted these days. But anyway, so the law, all right, is our way of stipulating these punishments. Okay, so there's the law, and I want to view the law as in service to ethics, right? So the ethics are the practices, and then we go into these specific places, and there are best practices, and then you put rules into effect in order to serve that. Okay. Now, that's all very well and good, but you want to ask some sorts of things like this. Are there unjust laws? And we live in a country, at least most of us who, if we're taking this course in the United States, we live in a country that was founded by revolting against the authority. And it's fairly interesting. It was in some cases thought of as a divine authority. Well, not quite, because John Locke had argued against the divine right of kings back in 1688 or that sort of stuff. But at any rate, the king was looked upon as some sort of authority, and the laws were looked upon as some sort of authority. That's why when the Declaration of Independence was written, it's a list of particulars of how the authority had violated its authority, so it's no longer legal authority. So there's a long tradition of revolution against unjust laws and civil disobedience and that sort of stuff. And clearly there are unjust laws. I mean, the laws for slavery are unjust laws. Okay, so there are unjust laws. Now, let's assume most of them are just, and if they are just, then you as a citizen under those laws are obliged to follow them. So When you ask the question, is it legal? If you say yes, it's legal, then it's okay to do it in most cases. Excuse me. Then there's another question. Are there ethical actions that violate the law? That is there some cases when we should violate the law? And I think here of the example of Les Miserables. Jean Valjean stole a loaf of bread. He stole a loaf of bread. Why? In order to feed his family. So he violated the law and feed the family. Sometimes there are higher causes. Okay? So there are ethical actions. The right thing to do is to steal a loaf of bread, but even though it violated the law. Now, another question might be, are there illegal actions, or are illegal actions always unethical? Well, of course, in case of Valjean, we're going to say, no, that action was illegal, but it wasn't unethical. But there are other ones. Some cases where we think it might not be an ethical issue. Suppose you are driving somewhere and it's a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, and you go with the flow of traffic, and the flow of traffic is going 65. Are you doing something unethical? You are certainly doing something illegal, but it's a question of whether it's unethical. And then finally, one other question we want to ask in here is, are there unethical actions that are not illegal? That is, are there some things that are not ethical, but they're not ethical, but they are still within the legal realm, or at least they are not illegal? And when we talk about that, I think about things like, oh, you lie to your spouse, or you lie to your parents. Lying, all right, is prima facie unethical, unless there's some sort of good reason for it. But lying is prima facie unethical. But is it illegal to lie to your parents or spouse? Nobody's going to put you in jail for that sort of stuff. Okay, so there's these various relationships between ethics and the law. First principle, I think, would be to obey the law, and then underline that, unless there is a very good reason for not obeying the law. And one good reason for not obeying the law is if two laws contradict one another. Because if two laws contradict one another, you can't obey both of them, and there's a primary rule in ethics which says ought implies can. You can't do both, so one or the other does not hold. All right, and so let me then sum this up with these conclusions. Law and ethics are not the same, but they are interrelated. And I think to think of the relationship in business, I think we want to think of it as this, in this way. Ethics is the spirit of the law. All right, the laws are there, as we said, to enforce the ethics of the practices that we are involved in. And so those people who violate the spirit, all right, and skirt the edges and game the system are probably doing something unethical, even though they may not be doing something illegal. Okay? Having said that, I want to move on now to our other primary question of ethics. We'll do that in the next section.